they presented me with this piece of paper to sign, and it was a partnership agreement. And my intuition that day was screaming at me saying, do not trust these two men. We had been unofficially working together for a couple of months prior to this. I didn't say no, and I signed that bit of paper that day. And very shortly afterwards, I had been completely kicked out of UNILAD, completely removed from the business. And I went to see a solicitor. I showed them what I had signed, and the solicitor said they're not allowed to have done this, but if you want to fight this, this is going to be won or lost in a courtroom. And my mind flashed forward to me in a busy courtroom and the instant comparison of the 7-year-old me in the classroom having that anxiety attack. And I remember running out of my solicitor's office and actually going to buy a bottle of vodka because that's what I knew would solve this anxiety. And I woke up in hospital the next morning, no memory of what happened, but the nurse told me that 2 members of the public had found me in an alleyway clutching the bottle still. Someone said to me, you could be one of the cool kids, Alex, if you weren't so weird, when I was about 7 years old. Had loads of comments like that compounded over my school years to create an adult that felt quite intrinsically different. And I think when I think about the type of mind that I have this internalized hyperactivity, this racing mind. I describe it as having 10 highly caffeinated squirrels. And sometimes that can create entrepreneurialism and creativity in some settings. But in other settings, that can turn into anxiety. Yeah. And I think the work that I'm doing now is really running away from that feeling of anxiety.
Yeah. How do you relate nowadays to the word weird, out of interest? I imagine it's not a nice thing to be told when you're a kid, but
not when you're a kid.
Weird feels a bit more.
Yeah, I lean into it now.
Yeah, exactly.
The older I get, I realize that the things that I was made to feel weird for when I was at school have turned out to be my greatest strengths. Mm-hmm. And the mistake I made when I was young was trying to hide that weirdness, trying to mask and pretend to be someone that I wasn't in order to get approval from people around me. I was the world's best actor, amazing at playing a character called Normal. I was a chameleon, constantly shape-shifting my personality, desperately trying to fit in all the time. And actually, looking back in hindsight, that constant requirement to change who I was to fit in was exhausting. And I'd get home and have absolutely no energy left to do anything. And it was as I got older and realized that I am different. And I truly believe now that great minds do think differently. And when I had that realization, that was when I lent into the weirdness and adjusted how I worked. And that's the moment I really started to thrive.
There's a degree of performance in all of these categories that we kind of itemized as well, right? And I wonder if you see a connection between the performance in public, something like this. You know, it's not that you're being untrue to yourself or inauthentic, on the contrary, right? But it's still a public persona. It's still a use of the self in a different setting. You know, do you maybe relate that to what I believe the term is masking, maybe from when you were younger? You know, do you think there's some continuity there? Because these are all forms of storytelling. You know, all your I'll get into this a little bit, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, everyone masks to a degree. It's a human survival instinct to want to be accepted in the tribe. And in modern day, that looks like putting your best foot forward, turning up as your best self for job interviews, day-to-day, podcast appearances. Mm-hmm. The extent to which someone masks is, I think, different for me, or used to be different for me and many people with ADHD, is the effect that it has on their well-being. Is the extent that they're doing it and how wide that gap is between the version of them that they're putting out into the world versus who they are underneath. Right. And I think when that gap is really, really wide, then that can cause a lot of quite concerning self-esteem issues, confidence issues, and quite nasty comorbidities, which we can get into if you like. It's certainly human to want to seek approval. But I think when you're doing it to such an extent that A, it's exhausting, and B, it's being really detrimental to your own well-being and your own progression, then I think that's when it needs to be addressed.
So you want a kind of a transparency of performer and self almost, in a way, you know?
Yeah, I think it's a mesh between the two. The Venn diagram of Alex out in public on the left versus Alex at home on the right, and the version in the middle. I think when the center of the diagram is very wide, then I think you might have an issue.
I mean, so it's interesting to come back to the CIOs, which of course you're not. We've spoken to dozens, and we interview many, right? Of course. And they're by no means all seeking to be influencers. That's not why they all come on the show and why they talk to us. But one thing they do absolutely have in common, it became very apparent to us as we started to talk to them and started to investigate the idea of kind of constructing a talk show around them as a guest, is that they all have a strong sense of personal autobiography, I would say. They're all storytellers, or they all have a story to tell. And as I said, just to come back to this, I have observed through your career, this element of storytelling keeps recurring, and it's sometimes indivisible from the entrepreneurial aspect, right? You see it in your current podcast, ADHD Chatter, but you could go back to Lab Bible. That's a form of storytelling as well, right? Like, what are your thoughts on that connection in general?
Oh, it's paramount. The ability to connect with somebody's core emotively, take them on a journey narratively, is how all brands will live or die on social media. I was doing it accidentally when I started UNILAD and Lab Bible when I was at university in 2010, telling stories that the demographic that I was targeting related to, and it grew incredibly fast. I'm doing it now with ADHD Chatter.
Yeah,
it's fundamentally about diving into the research, diving into the data, seeing what the community that you're trying to target cares about. What are their positive points? What are their pain points? Really diving into those, finding out the points of relatability and constructing stories around those. That's what I've done from day one. And then it's a conversation about understanding how to tell those stories on a landscape, social media that's ever changing.
Let's dig into a couple of those stories then from your own past, because actually, interestingly, you could argue that a more prior to founding UNILAD and Lab Bible, right, you had a more conventional kind of business idea, which is quite funny, where you were defrosting pizzas and distributing them to your local college community, right?
Yes.
Which is more of a brick and mortar style business, you could argue. That storytelling element wasn't quite there, but I mean, how well was that doing as a
Oh, it was doing well, and fundamentally, and actually, it was one of the early stories that I told on UNILAD, and people connected with it because it was funny. I went to university. I didn't get on at university. I went to one lecture, had a panic attack, left. But I went back to my university bedroom, and I had this idea to create this late night pizza delivery company. And I did impulsively spend half of my student loan on this huge freezer, about the size of this table, like 6 foot huge freezer. And the two delivery guys just about got it through my door frame, had it in my bedroom, looked ridiculous. It was half the size of the bedroom. Filled it with Tesco frozen pizzas and set up a Facebook page called Quick Pizza. And it was really simple. If you wanted a pizza in the middle of the night after the shops had shut, you'd message me. I'd put one in the oven, and I had about 5 people cycling around Oxford in the middle of the night delivering pizzas. Essentially, it was delivery before delivery started.
Sure, yeah.
But the university shut me down because I didn't have a food safety hygiene certificate. So I had the idea, but again, at that stage, it was the attention to detail that I was lacking.
I hadn't thought of it as the pre-delivery. You were truly ahead of your time with that one.
Well, for me, I knew students were hungry at 4 o'clock in the morning and there was no one selling food. And I wasn't the type to go out. So I was in my room anyway, having spare time, and it just seemed like a good problem to solve, and quite a simple one.
And this story became one of your earliest stories with UNILAD, right? The first book you published. So, and that was effectively like a storytelling and posting platform, though, that you were able to brand as a business and develop as a hugely successful kind of publishing business effectively.
Yeah. Lab Bible and UNILAD, essentially online story platforms for students to procrastinate in.
Yeah. And you mentioned that the kind of obsession over the mutating algorithm and learning to read it and anticipate it was as much a part of that creative process as presumably the writing of pieces or what you were choosing, right? It was a combination of data and storytelling. Would that be accurate?
Absolutely. You have to have it was an internal culture that I had unknowingly of testing. and really almost A/B testing every bit of content that I put out with different intros, different first sentences, if it was a text-based post, because at that stage I didn't have budget, so I couldn't run Facebook ads. So the only real way to test when the algorithm changed and when they swapped, for example, prioritizing long-form text-based posts over image posts or single-line text-based posts. All of these things were changing in the background. Facebook was experimenting themselves back then. So for me, the only way to really get transparency on what Facebook was prioritizing in the newsfeed was to test and test and test and really dive into the very limited data I had, which was really just the optics on how well they were doing. But I think that's what separated me from others doing similarly at the time, was my genuine enjoyment over this process of the testing.
Do you feel that, like, in a sense, nowadays you'll have a lot of, for instance, digital marketeers and in organizations and companies, they're all of these skills are amalgamated in what they do every day, whether it's content creation, the analysis of data, monetization of that content. And in a way, as an entrepreneur, you were out ahead of the curve in that sense, as a prototype of this kind of future employee almost. I mean, do you see it in those sort of terms?
I think so. I had various privileges. I am quite a loner, if you like. I wasn't tempted to go out and party, so I had that natural desire anyway to kind of stay in and hyper focus on my computer.
Yeah.
But I think any company, it's the actual landscape that these communities are built on is important, but it's the primary focus is nurturing this culture of curiosity and testing and always wanting to understand what the social media platforms want.
You made me think as well, in a way you were not only anticipating the kind of future marketeer in that original role, you also have a future model of the remote worker, effectively, no? And when you think about, you mentioned that it was quite consuming, it probably could be quite solitary, in being so consuming. And, obviously you do a lot of work presently on raising awareness around mental health as it pertains to ADHD specifically. I mean, do you have as you look at now the modern workplace, so distributed, so digital, so dispersed, do you think there's reasons to be concerned about the effect on employees' mental health because of this context of work and your own experience of doing so, particularly in your early years, kind of as a lone contributor or entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think it's such a good conversation to have, and it's so good that it's been happening now to such an extent with all of these neurodivergent conditions and generally mental health. It's anxiety that is getting in the way of a productive, happy person in the workplace, whether that's digital or in the office. It has to start with awareness coming from the top, how we can mitigate the effects of anxiety, and really recognizing that everyone's brain is as unique as their fingerprints, and therefore the common suggested accommodations that could help with anxiety, like flexible start times or not making webcams compulsory in online meetings or normalizing the use of fidget toys and noise cancelling headphones, walking meetings, all of these kind of things, which can be very beneficial to many. The individual, their needs are going to be very individual to them. And it's about creating a culture of psychological safety that will enable the person who otherwise might be sat there in silence, suffering in silence, to feel like they can ask for help without fear of discrimination or stigma or bullying. Because when you create that culture, actually, it's really basic stuff that will make such a big difference. I worked in a social media marketing agency in 2016 in an office, and it was a very busy office, very loud. There was a table tennis table pinging all the time. There was an office dog running around. There was a stereo playing music. Quite a cool place to work traditionally. But my mind in that situation, in that environment, was almost paralyzed. I couldn't do the job that I was being paid to do, which was to grow their Facebook following. And in 3 months, I had to leave because I was so anxious. And I grew their Facebook following from 0 to 5,000. And I got another job afterwards doing the same job, the exact same job. But I reflected on my experience and I said to my new boss, I said, can I work from home sometimes? Can I work downstairs in the cafeteria where it's quiet sometimes? And ultimately, can you trust me and judge me on my outcomes and not my processes? And they said yes. And in the same 3 months, I had grown their Facebook following from 0 to 8 million followers.
That's not bad. What year was this?
This was 2016.
2016, yeah. This is the ideal essence of a remote work principle, in fact, isn't it? You know, judge me on my outcomes, not how I do it, right? And what I was going to pick up on is almost what you're advocating for when we think about the technologists who come on the show, who watch the show, is the central, the humanizing of technology, the moderation of technology to make sure it fits the person. I mean, would you think that's an accurate kind of a modus operandi that technologists should be following, CIOs should be following?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think with any period of change, you have to avoid overwhelming people. And ultimately, that's really simple. It just means slow down, and make it really, really clear the different stages of that transition to the new software.
And coming back to your story, so you famously launched these 2 hugely successful brands, and then your story takes a bit of a left turn. And I know you've spoken about it before, so I don't feel intrusive, hopefully, asking you about it. But it sounded like a pretty horrendous experience where you effectively had your companies that you'd built, I think both of them, stolen from you. And I wonder if you maybe update people on that element of your story, first of all.
Yes, it was just UNILAD that I had the legal issues with. Lab Bible I grew and built and sold, and that was all very good. So when I was at university, it's interesting because I think you have to understand my upbringing, which was when I was at school, that anxious kid in the classroom, and I was sat at the back of my classroom one day at 7 years old and having a very happily daydreaming, and the teacher pointed at me and said, "Alex, do you know the answer to this question?" And I ran out of the classroom, had a huge panic attack in the corridor, called an ambulance, asked someone to call an ambulance for me. And when the paramedic arrived, they reassured me that I wasn't having a heart attack. I was having my first anxiety attack.
Right.
And I say that because it lays the foundation for what happened next, which was after I got back from university, having left because UNILAD and Lab Bible were growing so fast. I was sat in my bedroom. I had Lab Bible on one screen, UNILAD on the other screen, both on about 5-6 million followers each, both with inboxes that needed looking after, both with brand deal requests. Essentially, I was overwhelmed. I didn't know that word at the time, but that's how I would define the feeling now.
Fair enough, yeah.
And I certainly needed help. And I put out a post asking for help, and I met these 2 men. And we were all going to go into business together with regards to UNILAD. And I remember the day that I met them, they presented me with this piece of paper to sign, and it was a partnership agreement. And my intuition that day was screaming at me saying, do not trust these 2 men. We have been unofficially working together for a couple of months prior to this. I didn't say no, and I signed that bit of paper that day. And very shortly afterwards, I had been completely kicked out of UNILAD, completely removed from the business. And I went to see a solicitor. I showed them what I had signed. And the solicitor said they're not allowed to have done this, but if you want to fight this is going to be won or lost in a courtroom. And my mind flashed forward to me in a busy courtroom and the instant comparison of the 7-year-old me in the classroom having that anxiety attack. And I remember running out of my solicitor's office and actually going to buy a bottle of vodka because that's what I knew would solve this anxiety. And I woke up in hospital the next morning. No memory of what happened, but the nurse told me that 2 members of the public had found me in an alleyway clutching the bottle still. And I just remember feeling the shame and anxiety and embarrassment. And in that naive state, I thought the only thing that I need to cure this anxiety is more alcohol. And I knew there was a petrol station over the road selling alcohol. And so I stood up and ran out of the hospital ward. And before I knew it, I was on the floor, security had been called, and I was being restrained. And my parents had been called, and I remember looking at my mum, making eye contact with her. She just had this look of fear and desperation in her eyes. She didn't know what was wrong with me. I didn't know what was wrong with me at that stage. I didn't know what I was contending with in my head. Fast forward 2 months, the trial happened in London. It was a 3-week trial. I was cross-examined for 9 days. Even the judge said it was excessive, but I got through it. The judge was very accommodating. He let me take regular breaks. Fast forward another month and my telephone went, and it was my solicitor. And he said, "Alex, are you on your own?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You've won everything. You've won the company back." And I remember falling to my knees and bursting into tears because, yes, it was a 5-year legal battle. But for me, it was a huge mental health battle that nearly cost me my life and ultimately made me realize that there was something going on inside my head, some other thing that needed examining. And that really led me onto the path to discovering that I was neurodivergent and had ADHD.
Soul of the CIO is sponsored by Nextvink. Now, if you work in IT, you'll know too well how disruptions can derail productivity fast. Nextvink's AI-powered platform for digital employee experience keeps you ahead. It uncovers issues others can't see and resolves them automatically with employee-centric AI and always-on automation. Employees stay productive, IT stays proactive and even preventative, and leadership sees results. Nextvink, ahead of every IT disruption, behind every strategy. Learn more at nextvink.com. I guess for any ambitious person, whether they're an entrepreneur or whether they're a technologist climbing the ladder in a corporation, there's going to come a point when you're going to need, as you put it, support. You're going to need to build a team around you and stuff. And I guess this was a baptism of fire, or a very rough way to learn what not to do. What learnings were you able to take from that experience that could make you successful and could make other people successful when it comes to that very important part of the process of selecting the right people, of learning who to trust, of sharing responsibility?
Yeah, it's a great question. And had I known what I know now, and that really is to understand why you might be feeling a desire to people please, which is ultimately why I signed that bit of paper.
Sure.
I people pleased on that day because I was so fearful of encountering a rejection and being criticized. The pain for me of being criticized or rejected is so visceral. It's so intense. It's physiological. Someone can say that they're too busy to see me, and it's like an instant dagger to the chest, and they've turned it. It can completely derail my day. And the easiest way to protect yourself from that pain is to say yes to everything. It's to seek approval. It's to be a yes man. And that's what happened to me that day. So since then, I've really worked on my self-awareness, which I encourage anyone to do. Ask yourself some really basic questions. What happened today that made me sad? What happened today that made me happy? What happened today that I struggled with? What happened today that I found easy? If you do that simple exercise enough, you can build up this arsenal of self-awareness that will give you an edge and enable you to really understand why you are fearful of rejection. And once you understand why you're fearful of rejection, you can start standing up for yourself and saying no to things that you might not want to do. And ultimately, I think my biggest advice, when you're going into business with someone and deciding whether to sign that bit of paper, ultimately, is to really trust your intuition, really, really trust your gut. It's incredibly strong. But you've got this internal conflict of your gut, your intuition telling you this person is a nice person or this person is a wrong person. I can tell they're a wrong and don't trust this person. But then on the other side, pulling you the other way is this want and almost knee-jerk reaction to people please and ignore it. It's so important to your gut will know before anyone else. And it's so important to listen to those signals that your body give off. If someone's giving you bad vibes, then pay attention to those and dig deeper before you commit.
Yeah, of course. And I guess as a successful business person, you have to be unpopular sometimes, right? Like that's part and parcel of it.
Well, that's what I've learned. I think I was 20 years old when I didn't trust my intuition, and it triggered a court case that was nearly horrendous.
Yeah.
So I was very naive. I didn't know.
That's pretty young to be very. Yeah.
So now you've got to put boundaries in place.
Yeah.
You've got to not be scared of offending people, because I don't think anyone's really not scared of offending people, but you've got to be okay with saying no. and being okay that no is a complete sentence. And I think a lot of the time, if you do struggle with saying no, you can firstly do three things. Firstly, being aware that you have a tendency to say yes almost as a knee-jerk reaction. And secondly, turn that yes into a can I let you know tomorrow? It's a very simple reframe. Had I done that when I was 20 years old, when I was presented with that bit of paper, if I had simply said, can I take this home and let you know tomorrow? I'm 100% certain that I would have not signed it. It would have got me out of that people-pleasing danger zone and just put a pause and a breaker between the ask of my time, the ask of my attention, the ask of my signature on that day, and my response to it, which if you just put that 24-hour breaker period, 9 times out of 10, it is a no. You come out of that hyper-focus, you come out of that people-pleasing version of yourself, and you're able to look at all of the data points and analyze the situation and say, actually, no, this is not for me.
Out of interest, how old were the guys who were trying to manipulate you?
They were, one was similar age, one was about 3 years older.
Okay, yeah. We were talking about that dynamic between human creativity and technology earlier. And obviously you've been a leading voice in online media now for over a decade. What are your observations on how AI is reshaping that space presently?
I think AI is really powerful. It can certainly save time. In the podcast space now, I think it's certainly great for thumbnail creation. I don't think it's personally there yet in terms of saving people time when it comes to sending emails or writing copy, because I think it's very transparent when someone is using AI at the moment. I get a ton of emails and I genuinely ignore the ones that are written by AI. It's so instantly obvious that it's been written by AI, and I can kind of see the process. I think they're saving time, but it lacks that human connection that so many of us crave. And part of my brain goes, if they're cutting corners at this very early stage, then where are they else going to be cutting corners later on down the line? So I think people think that they're saving time with some uses of AI, but I think ultimately it's costing them a lot of credibility.
I completely agree. And I couldn't help but notice, with your creativity presently, you're leaning into a bit like this show, the in-person, pretty much AI-able, format of a video podcast, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, do you feel like instinctively moving towards those spaces which are hardest to emulate at the moment, and that not just because you want to do that, but because audiences are looking for that authenticity too?
Human beings crave social connection. I truly believe that podcasts are the antidote for loneliness. A lot of people, like the data shows this, a lot of people watch podcasts, they're not really paying attention to them a lot of the time. They just have them on in the background whilst they're brushing their teeth, or whilst they're driving, or whilst they're in their flat on their own and they're lonely. People feed off real human interaction. And there's a ton of reasons why AI can get in the way of that. I think doing virtual interviews, again, it has the same effect. It's still two people talking to each other, but you can pick up on the authenticity and the connection when, like you and me now, we're sat in the same room, and there'll be little micro facial expressions, little shifting of our feet, little tones of voice changes that are because we're in person. Subconsciously, we don't even know we're doing them, but they wouldn't be happening if we were on different sides of a computer screen. And the audience will pick up on that as well, and it will add to that connection which so many people are lacking, particularly in 2025. And I think that's why podcasts are booming at the moment. Yes, they are a source of passive knowledge building, which is great. You can listen to them on your commute whilst you're running, and you can build your knowledge on pretty much any topic you want at the moment. But fundamentally, I think they are the antidote to loneliness. I think that's why they're so popular. And if you are producing a podcast, I think you have to have that in mind at the forefront, and really lean into what makes that experience of curing somebody's loneliness as optimal and as effective as possible. And I think that has to be face-to-face interviews like this one and many others are doing.
That's so interesting. And I guess a related question is the question of online communities, right, which you've been very successful at building in the past. And again, it's a palliative for loneliness, effectively, a different way of addressing the loneliness issue, arguably. What do you see as the future of the online communities and their relationship to digital media, and what should entrepreneurs be thinking about when it comes to building and nurturing those audiences specifically as a group?
So the only thing that's going to change fundamentally is the landscape and the platforms and how they're delivered. If someone asked me how do you make a good social media community today versus how would you make it 15 years ago when I started Lad Bible, the fundamentals aren't different. It's exactly the same. You have to understand who your target audience are, really understand what their specific pain points are, all their points of relatability, and tell stories around those points. The way you deliver those messages, that's what changes, and that's where that testing culture comes in, to understand the best way to deliver those stories on the platforms that exist today. The fundamentals aren't going to change. The method of delivery will be changing in the future. Who knows? In 10 years, we'll be wearing contact lenses and really immersed in the content and immersed in the stories. And of course, that is a different modality of deliverable. But the fundamentals of what makes humans tick and what builds a connection between them and someone that they're following or a show that they're listening to, that's not going to change. So I think, again, it's really doubling down on your understanding about what makes good content, why people connect with narratives and storytelling, which is just understanding human psychology. And then within the team, when you are looking to build communities, doubling down on that culture of testing, so you make sure you don't get left behind when a platform does make an algorithm change and suddenly they're prioritizing video content that's a minute and a half long rather than a minute and 10 seconds long, because all of these changes are happening silently in the background, and it's the entrepreneurs that are running the tests and figuring those little changes out that will get ahead.
Do you see video as kind of the main media vehicle for connectivity for the foreseeable future? Are there any new forms of media which have your attention for their power to sort of facilitate that kind of connectivity?
I think video is the forefront now, has been for quite a few years. I mean, based on the technology that we have at the moment, I think it will be the forefront still for years to come.
Yeah. Be interested to know your view as a founder around that dynamic we touched upon between technology and the business today. Based upon your own journey, what do you think today's business leaders and particularly CIOs should understand about how tech can drive not just efficiency, but creativity, inclusion, and ultimately impact in the business?
So I think as a business leader, it's really important to stay on top of the mental health of your team. That goes without saying, but I think it's really using tech to enable your team to show you how they're feeling. I think you have to give your team tools that will enable them to almost track their progress. If I look at the three things that I think stop a team being happy and mentally healthy, it's burnout, it's self-awareness, and imposter syndrome are the three things that will get in the way of your team being as optimal as possible. And when you enable them to be able to have a transparent way of communication with the leader, then they're able to take away a lot of the shame that comes around openly discussing this. In ADHD Chatter and my previous businesses, that the tech looked really basic. It wasn't even that complex. Essentially, it was a questionnaire that went round and we had qualitative feedback from the team about how they were feeling. I think imposter syndrome is huge, because when you are moving really fast in a startup or as an entrepreneur or the team around you, you can move really fast, you can make big strides forward. But if you're not sort of intentionally pausing and inputting your experiences into some system that the company can read, then you're not cementing that evidence of achievement in your subconscious. And if you don't take the pause to cement the evidence of your achievement in your subconscious when you are tasked with doing the same thing again, then you feel underqualified. You feel like you're the wrong person to do the job, and that creates a lot of anxiety. And also burnout. Again, it's the second one. It's really becoming aware what your early signs of burnout are, so you know when it's time to sort of take your foot off the pedal and slow down a bit. My early signs of burnout is if I become more irritable, or if I start ordering more takeaway food, or if my dog walk gets neglected. And these are all signs that I need to slow down. And I think I use a really basic tech to keep an eye on that. I almost do like a quantitative self-survey of how I'm feeling day to day. And if I score above a certain average, then it notifies me that I need to take a pause. It's not that complex, the tech, in order to stay on top of your team's mental health and well-being, particularly when it comes to inclusion, where we know there's heightened rates of burnout and anxiety and imposter syndrome in that community. So I think it's really important to show that you're understanding, because when you give really basic tech to your team and you say, okay, we're going to use this to document how we're all feeling and scale our mental health, and it creates that culture that it's a place where they can communicate these topics freely and without prejudice and without feeling like they'll be bullied if they open up about it. And it goes back to that creating psychological safety. And if you have a culture of delivering tech to your team and all of these topics are openly discussed, and it's just part of how your office or culture company works, then you're going to have a much happier and a much more productive workforce.
A related issue would seem to me the potential intrusiveness of workplace technology, right? And you cited a really interesting example earlier where you said, the sense of obligation of always being on camera, something that kind of reaches into everybody's private space and kind of wrenches them into the public space or the shared space of the workplace. To a degree that can not only perhaps feel distasteful, but also maybe detrimental or counterproductive in terms of getting the best out of everybody's creativity and productivity, right? I mean, how should people modulate their approach to that intrusive element of technology in the workplace?
Yeah, it goes back to taking steps to reduce things that are making people anxious. Mm-hmm. I think it's really basic stuff, like not requiring webcams to be on. I think it's in meeting settings, for example, giving the questions ahead of time, giving the agenda ahead of time, so people know what they're walking into. You take away that uncertainty of what's happening next. Really basic transcribing software that can be turned on during meetings. Many people in meetings and group settings, they can be present, but they can be masking, full of anxiety. And because so much of that mental energy is going into appearing normal, that they're not taking in what's being said, and they're definitely not going to remember it. So if they're tasked with doing a project that's based on what was said in that meeting, then they're going to really struggle, and they're going to come across, or they're definitely going to feel like they're stupid. Really basic transcribing software that can just transcribe what's said in meetings and emailed around to everyone in attendance, and that's not advanced stuff. Not letting the loudest voice in meetings dictate the decision. And I think so often in a meeting, the problem is put to the group, and the loud extroverted person will shout out an answer, and the company will run with that solution. But quite often the anxious person will be sat there quiet, tapping their foot with a brilliant idea, but they just can't access that in that moment. And I think if you can give a grace period at that juncture, if it's not urgent, and the group can go away with the information and submit an idea through email, really basic stuff. You provide a grace period. You put a pause between the ask and the solutions. So I think a lot of the time in business settings, particularly in early stage startups, the best ideas are trapped inside anxious minds. And it's about putting a pause between the ask and those ideas that will enable people to go away in a safe place, activate that brilliance, that creativity that's inside their head, and submit it to the group in a safe way.
Looking ahead, Alex, you've obviously had significant success in your career so far. When you look forward about what you want to achieve next, are you primarily motivated by the prospect of further success, or the idea of facilitating more of that connectivity and human connectivity, which is obviously so important to you?
So I'm looking for to continue growing the ADHD Chatter podcast, ultimately, I think so many people have been lacking genuine connection and genuine storytelling because they don't know who they really are. And I'm particularly talking about the ADHD community. You've got a whole generation of people who have been told their entire life that they're too sensitive, or that they're too much, or that they're weird, or that they're not enough, or that they're crazy by their doctors. And they don't understand why some people just seem to glide through life and achieve stuff with apparent ease, and yet certain things for them are so challenging. They don't understand why the tiniest real or perceived criticism is so physically painful for them. They don't understand why they have to change their entire personality and put on this mask in order to be more likable for whoever they're standing in front of. I wish I could go back in time and put my arms around the younger version of me having that panic attack in the classroom and reassure him that he's not broken, he's just different, and that he is enough. But there are so many people who don't have that reassurance. So for me, it's about continuing to grow the podcast, continuing to provide a platform that gives millions and millions of people that feel different still today a story to listen to, a story to tell that they see themselves in. And it gives them the confidence to maybe go for an assessment, or maybe just to strip away some of the shame that they've been feeling for years and years and years. Too many people have been let down, particularly by the medical community, been told that they're too lazy, too much. And you've got millions of people playing catch up. And that's my goal, to continue growing the podcast, to provide this resource for that community to listen to hear a conversation, and they finally realize that they're not broken, they're just different, and that they have been and always have been enough.
It's a great motivation. And Alex, you might not have been a CIO before, but I think you got a lot of insight, which will be of great interest to the audience. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.